This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books. We are living through the reshaping of the world. Neighborhood raids and imperial aggression aim to create compliance and pacification. But against the forces of fear and division, our communities are standing up with stunning acts of bravery and organization. Old networks and tactics are being revived, and new alliances are being forged. It's never been more urgent for us to come together and strengthen our movements by learning from one another. This September 4th through 7th in Chicago, join thousands of activists, organizers, abolitionists, and socialists at the Socialism Conference, the place to sharpen analysis, hone strategy, and build community. The Socialism 2026 program will feature hundreds of participatory discussions, lectures, debates, and workshops. Speakers will include Angela Y. Davis, Saul Williams, Amy Goodman, Dorothy Roberts, Olufemi Taiwo, Sophie Lewis, Sarah Jaffe, and many, many more. Brought to you by Haymarket Books. Visit socialismconference.org to learn more and register by June 19th for the discounted early bird rate. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting on the road, currently from Vienna, Austria. This is the 5th episode of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Nusantara is a word that refers to the vast geographic archipelago that only through centuries of colonial capitalism and the struggles against it became a nation, one whose boundaries, identities, and purpose remain contested to this day. This episode picks up where the last one left off, continuing the story of the decade and a half between Indonesia winning sovereignty from the Dutch and the murderous onset of the New Order dictatorship in 1965. Suharto's long dictatorship inaugurated with a mass anti-communist genocide. Here are some key themes for you to keep track of. One key theme is the collapse of liberal democracy in the late 1950s and Sukarno's imposition of guided democracy. Another theme is a series of armed conflicts that ultimately destabilized Sukarno's rule while strengthening the military that would overthrow him. First, the spreading Darul Islam rebellion, an Islamist rebellion that, you will recall, began in West Java during the revolution. Second, the secessionist PRRI Permesta rebellions on Sumatra and Sulawesi. Third, the conflict with the Dutch to secure control over West Papua. And finally, fourth, confrontasi, Sukarno's program of mass social mobilization and military incursions against the British creation of the new state of Malaysia from its colonies in Malaya and the northern side of Borneo. Running through all of this was a spiraling economic crisis from the late 1950s onward, a crisis that undercut Sukarno's once impregnable legitimacy and that empowered the military to overthrow him and to destroy the Communist Party of Indonesia, or PKI. Let's start with Darul Islam, which declared itself the Islamic State of Indonesia. Throughout the 1950s, Islamist insurgencies raged in West Java, South Sulawesi, South Kalimantan, and Central Java. We neglected to discuss this important subject in the actual interview. There's just too much to talk about, so I want to talk about Darul Islam here so that you know. Sometimes doing a history podcast like this, you realize that you missed something big after the fact. This is one such case. Anyhow, you'll recall our discussion a few episodes back of Darul Islam, a rebellion that began in West Java in 1949. This Islamist rebellion was launched by Kartosuwiryo, who, as a young boy, passed through the house of Sarekat Islam leader Cokro Aminoto. just as nationalist Sukarno and communist Musso and so many others did. The Darul Islam rebellion continued even after the revolution against the Dutch was victorious. In September 1953, it spread to Aceh, fueled by opposition to the province being merged with North Sumatra and by demands for the implementation of Islamic law. Aceh was thus declared part of Kartosuwiryo's proclaimed Islamic State of Indonesia. The rebellion spread to Kalimantan in 1954, led by Ibnu Hajar, a former Indonesian military officer. Hajar initially led a militia called Kesatuan Rakyat Tertindas, Unity of the Oppressed People. It later joined Kartosuwiryo's Islamic State of Indonesia. Over in South Sulawesi, the rebellion emerged under the leadership of Kahar Muzakar, who opposed a reorganization of the Indonesian National Armed Forces that excluded the militia that he led. Later, this movement likewise integrated itself into the Islamic State of Indonesia. Darul Islam also spread to Central Java under the leadership of Amir Fatah, who operated on the island's north coast. These rebellions were only completely suppressed in 1962 after Kartosuwiryo was caught, sentenced to death, and executed. The PRRI Permesta rebellions broke out in 1957. The rebellions began separately on Sumatra and Sulawesi. They have complex but interrelated roots. One major factor was that the military that emerged from the revolution was highly decentralized and underfunded. As a result, regional commanders operated like warlords with incredible autonomy. They developed their own economic interests and sources of revenue, including smuggling. Nusushin, the powerful army chief of staff, wanted to centralize military command, sparking resistance from the regions. The Sumatra-based PRRI and Sulawesi-based Permesta formally merged their efforts in February 1958. The central government quickly defeated PRRI in mid-1958. Permesta rebels only surrendered in 1961. It's necessary to add a class element to these dynamics unfolding here within the Indonesian military. Recall the policy of Rira-TNI, or Reconstruction and Rationalization of the Indonesian National Armed Forces. It was a policy led by the military elite, with Nusushin at its head. It filtered troops based on education and competence. And yet, as we've discussed, much of the revolutionary forces were uneducated lower-class militias that organically had formed all over the country. These were the troops who rebelled against the Republic. The TNI structure, it was dominated by the educated elite. The rebellions were led by the militias who the professionalized officer class sought to purge or control. Meanwhile, the secessionist military commanders and the civilian leaders around them, civilian leaders from Syariah's Socialist Party of Indonesia, or PSI, and Masyumi, which included the modernist Islamic organization Muhammadiyah, they were staunchly anti-PKI and alarmed by the growing communist power under Sukarno. Anti-communism helped form unity among rebels with diverse, disparate causes. The CIA covertly intervened to back the rebellion, an intervention that was dramatically revealed when one of their pilots was shot down during a bombing run and captured. The U.S. under President Eisenhower had turned back against Sukarno, upset by his Third Worldist refusal of Cold War alignment and at his increasing elevation of the PKI. But after this scandal, the U.S. shifted back to attempting to appease Sukarno, all while continuing to deepen relations with a military whom they understood might eventually come to power. The shift from liberal democracy was underway by 1957 when Sukarno declared martial law amid the rebellions. But guided democracy officially began in 1959 when Sukarno declared an end to elections. The liberal democratic order was to be replaced by a cabinet representing the nation's most important political forces. Important political forces handpicked by the president. Half the seats were allocated to functional groups, government loyalists, the military, labor unions, peasants, religious leaders. It was all designed to replace traditional political party-based representation. Meanwhile, Sukarno repressed the parties most critical of his revolution, the PSI and Masyumi. PSI's position as the technocratic party is important to understand here. Guided democracy was presented as an alternative to liberal democracy, but also specifically to technocracy and to the notion that the West provided the only viable model for modernization. Many PSI leaders were staunchly anti-communist, positioned themselves as social democrats, and were viewed as champagne socialists. In one sense, suppressing the PSI could be seen as making a clean break with the West, but that, of course, isn't quite right, because the army, the West and the United States' most important force in Indonesian politics, the army only grew in strength. In Sukarno's conception, liberal democracy didn't work in Indonesia. In fact, liberalism was central to the problem as he saw it. Guided democracy was part of a larger global revolution against the old forces of colonialism and imperialism. Indonesia was to set an example for the rest of the world, to reimagine a liberated society. Liberalism was part of the problem because, he believed, it was an individual-based society that had made imperialism and colonialism possible. The reinvention of the Indonesian state and society within guided democracy would instantiate a truly democratic form of representation distinct from Western institutions like political parties and parliaments. It would do so through a corporatist state. Both the state and the economy would be opened up to participation through these so-called functional groups sitting in parliament, in government, and on company boards. Labor and class-based conflict that undermined the economy would be harmonized. Economic growth through consensus and cooperation would thus be achieved. This, of course, was an idealized model. It quickly discovered its severe limits and contradictions. In practice, guided democracy simultaneously empowered both the military and the PKI amid spiraling military, geopolitical, and economic crises, a dynamic that would create the conditions for the military to destroy the PKI and Sukarno's government. The PRRI Permesta rebellion played out as conflict with the Dutch over West Papua intensified. The Dutch had held on to West Papua after Indonesian independence. Sukarno insisted that it was rightfully part of the Indonesian Republic, the revolution's unfinished business. In 1957, Sukarno nationalized major industries owned by Dutch capitalists. PKI-aligned workers were often at the lead, but the military soon seized control, making these industries cash cows and power centers for the armed forces, which, in the meantime, also severely mismanaged the enterprises. This is when the economy started spiraling into a deeper and deeper crisis. In 1961, Sukarno intensified the military and geopolitical crisis with the Dutch over West Papua, giving his famous Trikora, or Triple Command of the People speech, on December 19, 1961, calling for the mobilization of the, quote, entire Indonesian people to take control of West Papua. This time, the U.S. sought to appease Sukarno, helping push the Dutch to cede the territory. The U.S. also presciently spotted an opportunity for U.S. capital to access the territory's vast natural resources. In 1962 and 63, Indonesia took control. The colonization process was ratified by a sham referendum in 1969, the so-called Act of Free Choice, It was a farce of a process that was actually an act of no choice for Papuans, because the outcome was entirely predetermined. What the people of West Papua thought, it wasn't really taken into account at all, which led to a West Papuan struggle against Indonesian colonialism that continues in the face of heavy repression to this day. Indonesia always described West Papuans as too primitive to take control over their own self-determination. The same sort of thing that the Dutch had long said about Indonesians in general. Then came confrontatie. Sukarno announced a mass national mobilization to disrupt Britain's formation of the new state of Malaysia. The military mounted direct incursions, which they often held back from fully conducting because they opposed Sukarno's strategy. Indonesia also trained communist militants, mostly Chinese, in North Borneo. Under Suharto, Indonesia would run a long and brutal counterinsurgency against those very same militants trained under Sukarno. This brings us right up to the eve of 1965, when Suharto would exploit a left-wing military coup to seize power and orchestrate the murder of hundreds of thousands of communists and alleged communists, which is where we'll pick up in the next episode. Before we get any deeper into it all, please support The Dig at patreon.com/thedig. What other podcast provides such in-depth analysis of everything we possibly can in terms of politics, history, economics, throughout time, across space? If you regard The Dig as indispensable to helping you make sense of the world, please know that you, our listeners, you are indispensable to making this podcast happen. Please support us now. Plus, we have great merch. That's patreon.com/thedig. Okay, here's Rianne Subijanto, Mada Supriatma, and Farabi Fakih for episode 5 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media, Indoprogress.com. Made Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Farabi Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department of Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. Let's take a moment to assess the Indonesian economy in the 1950s after independence. Indonesia, like many decolonizing countries, had become structurally relegated to a position of dependency within the larger world capitalist system, dependent upon the export of raw materials and without the capacity for high value-added industrial production. And internally, the economy was really divided between colonial enclaves, plantations, oil, et cetera, integrated into these global circuits, and then entirely disconnected domestic sectors like small-scale agricultural production. Describe the shape of this underdeveloped, uneven economy that Indonesia inherited at independence, and how did various domestic elites benefit from that overall economic order, even as it radically underdeveloped the country as a whole? And then lastly, how did various nationalist, revolutionary, radical forces, Sukarno, the PKI, other currents in power blocks, how do they aim to break out of that neo-colonial bind to achieve not just political independence from the Dutch, but also true economic sovereignty?
Okay, yeah. So the Indonesian economy in the 50s inherited to a large degree the colonial economy because it was the colonial economy was sort of recreated during the revolutionary period because the Dutch primary aim was to reestablish its economic position in the archipelago. So, for instance, the Operasi Product in 1947. So, for a lot of the major economic operations, it had started to be continued in the late 40s. So, the Indonesian economy in the 50s was primarily an export driven economy, just like the colonial period. And up until the late 50s, it actually maintained a 5% growth rate. So it's quite a good economy overall because the Dutch sort of restarted its export economic sector. But of course, it was the colonial economy. It was an economy that was very much controlled by several large Dutch firms, in particular, five multinational Dutch firms, which controlled much of the sector of the plantation sector. And then, of course, you had the oil sector, which is dominated by two American oil giants and one Dutch, the Royal Dutch Shell. Now, within the Indonesian people, it's actually also varied because in Java, it was a rather primitive economy, subsistence economy. But outside of Java, the economic base of people, a lot of it was smallholder agriculture, including smallholder plantation industry. And so if you look at stuff like, for instance, rubber, it was actually dominated by Sumatran smallholders instead of like large Dutch corporation. And their access to especially markets in Singapore and Malaya, especially Singapore. So there was actually a vibrant export economy of smallholders in Sumatra, in Borneo, and that actually resulted in a deep division between Java's economy and the outer islands economy. And so they had different aims and different positions. And when we talk about later on about the PRRI rebellion, that actually also come into play because the people in Sumatra wasn't as anti-Western as those in Java because they were in some ways partially integrated into the global economy through their links with Singapore, for instance, and because of their position as petty bourgeois, as people with stakes in the export economy. In the context of Sukarno, he doesn't have a very clear vision of how economic nationalism should be conducted. So a lot of the economic policy making in the 50s was emanated from within the University of Indonesia or within the start of technocratic institutions like the National Planning Board. And these followed very much a more westernized concept. But primarily they were looking at how do we nurture Indonesian capitalists, because the idea was that colonialism has smothered out any chances of an independent capitalist group. I mean, of course, there was a major capitalist group in Indonesia, which were the Indonesian Chinese, but they weren't considered part of the nation at the time. And so there were efforts by the state to nurture national capitalists through incentives, providing, for instance, export licenses and access to credits. But these oftentimes failed and results in corruption. But the vision was some form of industrialization support by the state through nurturing national capitalist businessmen. The PKI itself, I think, has a different vision of economic development. So they've sort of analyzed that the primary reason why Indonesian capitalists never emerged was because there was a lot of rent seeking in various sectors within the state. So they've sort of identified what kind of rent seekers that have resulted in not allowing for Indonesian people to accumulate marginal amount of capital to become the basis for their economic growth. And these were what they call the so-called the devils, right? The seven devils in six devils in the rural areas, or seven devils. And so they've identified bureaucrats, they've identified credit lenders, money lenders, and so forth. And so it was a much more structural approach. The idea was, if you eliminated these rent-seeking structures, then you could allow for the emergence of an independent, productive class. They were actually one of the only groups in the political spectrum that supported national capitalist groups, particularly those of the Chinese origins. So it's ironic that they were really one of the few groups within the spectrum that actually supported Chinese national capitalists in Indonesia. So they weren't as anti-capital in that sense, right? As whereas a lot of the other groups, especially Masyumi and PSI, they were very much championing an Indonesian, meaning native Indonesian capitalist group that they needed to be fostered and created. But very few of the groups supported nationalization, I think, with the exception of the PKI. The nationalization in 57 was to some extent unprepared and unanticipated.
Yeah, that's actually quite correct. I think the reason why the PKI supported the Chinese was actually because they focus on anti-imperialism. So by seeing that, okay, we gain political sovereignty, but economically we are largely actually still dependent on Western powers, right? Basically, most of the economy was still operated and owned by Western capital, and as actually three quarters of that Western capital belonged to the Dutch, and so the PKI still saw Indonesia as trapped in this system of imperialism plus feudal remnants. So because of that, their strategy was, instead of having an immediately go to socialism, they want to pursue national democratic state, national democracy first. So breaking imperialist control, dismantling landlord power, and then building a national economy. And so because their focus is on this national economy, they want to support nationalization and also national through the Chinese capital. And so their core, the three cores of their strategy is this anti-imperialism, expelling foreign capital, supporting nationalization. Actually, this will prove to be applied. Meaning, this is actually gonna support what's gonna happen later, right? In the late 50s and early 60s with West Papua, and then nationalization, the taken over again under foreign capital and infrastructure under the guided democracy. And then there is also the push for land reform. So the seven devils is one of them, but is one of the tactics or the actions under this land reform policy, and also mobilizing presence. And then also the other core is actually democracy. Again, PKI is big in terms of expanding mass participation, especially to shift power balance. And this, I hope we will talk more later, because I think in Abi's book, he does discuss about, this difference, the two strain of not just structure, but also approaches to governing Indonesia, which is based on mass mobilization, based on politics, and the other one is through this managerial, modernization processes. And so how did they do this strategy in practice? One later on we'll see through United Front strategy that we discussed before, building a broad coalition, including through workers, peasants, BTI, and then the national bourgeoisie. They actually want to work together with the national bourgeoisie. And this is also another thing that's important and also that differentiated PKI with China, which is to work within the state alongside Sukarno and nationalist forces instead of try to overthrow them.
I think in general pictures, one big void in Indonesian independence is the definition of economic nationalism. We don't have that. What kind of economy do we have? Our constitution not really directly address that question. In some part, it looked like a socialist economy, but it is not. And then our vice president at that time, Muhammad Hatta, who is an economist himself, come up with an idea economy, the people's economy based on cooperatives. So, but it's never translated into a real economy, what kind of basis economy. And also, I think it's also in the left. There's all a kind of mixed feelings. Of course, everybody was anti economic colonialism dominated by the Dutch. We have to replace them. But with what? That's the biggest question at that time. And then the only viable alternative is the Chinese capitalists and the pribumi, the native capitalists, which is very underdeveloped. But the Chinese, they have all of the network. And in the 50s, this create kind of tensions among the political parties. And then as Abi said, that's a rent seeking. We have a term for that, the Alibaba. The Ali is the natives, the pribumi, and the Baba is the Chinese. So the Ali, which has a connection on politics, who holds a political power, issues, they got the permits, they got the contract. And then because they don't have any experience in business, and they give the contract to the Chinese who run the business, who run everything. So these kind of things hit as some things. I think it's similar in the present days in Indonesia. This kind of things is working also. And then, yeah, some of nationalists, especially in the among the Muslims, because they are regarded as a pro-native capitalist, and also some nationalists. They come up with the what's so called is program Benteng. This is the Fortress program, which aim to nurture the pribumi capitalists. So this is I think the source of the Alibaba connections. So they issues the contracts, and then the Baba runs the business. And also later on, also in the 50s, the military started to jump into the business, especially the local commanders, because the military was so poorly funded. They don't have enough to even feed their members, their troops. So the local commanders began to involve in the business, and they worked with the Chinese. The most famous example for this is Suharto, when he becomes the commander of Diponegoro Regional Command. He works with exactly the same guys who will later on become the Indonesian tycoon, like Lim Shu Leong or Sudono Salim with the Salim Group and some others Chinese, and then they exist until now. The military also involved in smuggling. They smuggled commodities from Indonesia, so they got monies, and they saved the money in Singaporean banks and so on. So they become powerful in the region, and it is very hard to control. And later on, we will see the regional rebellions. I think the backbone of the regional rebellion are this military who are involved in business, working with the Chinese capitalists, and also going everywhere in the business and define themselves as a political force and economic force besides defense forces. In terms of the economy in the 50s, we have no clear directions. And we want to have a strong native capitalist, but at the same time, there's already the Chinese who runs the business. They are the capitalist class actually in Indonesia. So this kind of disconnect will I think will affect Indonesian economic future definitely now.
One thing I want to add, actually, the Benteng program, which Blimade has mentioned before, it was actually designed by Indonesia's first professional economist, Sumitlojo Hadikusumo, who is the father of the current president. So just a small fact there.
Yeah, let's dive right into those regional rebellions that you just mentioned, Mada. Indonesia, as we've really been discussing for much of the series, it was as a nation a creation of colonial rule and the revolution against it, this back and forth dialectic of domination and rebellion. All of these just innumerable polities, ethnicities, languages into an Indonesian people speaking one Indonesian language, saluting one Indonesian flag, and singing one national anthem, Indonesia Raya. But from the beginning, very much through today, various regions and ethnicities have resisted their incorporation into this unified national identity and state. And as we discussed earlier, among the Republic's opening acts was to crush a rebellion in Ambon, one of those very early colonized islands in the Moluccas, a region whose mostly Christian population had ascended the ranks of the colonial army and was even eligible for a special citizenship status. But the most important secessionist conflict erupted in the late 1950s. And this is quite a mouthful of a name for a conflict, the PRRI, Permesta Rebellion. It was regional military commanders allied in various ways with civilians who led protests and then outright rebellions on the islands of Sumatra and Sulawesi. The revolutionary government of the Republic of Indonesia, or PRRI rebellion, that began in the west in Sumatra, and the Permesta rebellion that took off in the east in Sulawesi. They began separately and then joined forces. How did these large bloody conflicts erupt and then combine? What sort of struggles over power and resources were taking place that motivated various military and civilian leaders to rebel against the central government? What were these divides between the outer islands and Java, but also within outer islands like Sulawesi, which was deeply divided by region? What were the rebel military leaders? What were they demanding from the central government, specifically from Sukarno? What role did anti-communism play in motivating it? And we'll get to the U.S. role in a moment, which is very important, but this is plenty for part one of the question.
Yeah, I think the main reason why this commander in the region are rebelling against the central government is that because they have too much power. In the 50s, as I say, that they are involved in so many things economically, and they also have the duty to feed their troops, to buy weapons and everything, because during the revolutions, the central government whatsoever, they didn't get support from the central government. So what they are doing is they are involved in a smuggling business and also racketing business, and also running a business for themselves. And some of these commanders pocketing the profit for themselves, for their families, and for their cronies. General Nasution, when he come back to become the chief of staff of the army, and he wants to discipline all of this, to want to establish the command and control from the central government. He also shared another vision with all of these generals from outer island, that they are very anti-communist, because they are, at that time they started already confiscated the plantation, confiscated the manufacture, the factories belong to the foreign government, and then they clashed with the workers who are organized by the PKI. That's create a tension between all of this military and the commander in the region. And that start when they create the council, the Dewan Banteng, or the bulls councils in Sumatra, for example. And they are demanding that Sukarno banned the Communist Party in Jakarta. But that's the political reason. But beneath that, these generals, these commanders are already become a warlord in each of their regions. And also, I think PRRI in Sumatra is a little bit different from Permesta in Sulawesi, because in Permesta, they have, I don't know whether I'm right or not, but they have less resources compared to the commander in Sumatra. Because in Sumatra, if you are in Sumatra, you really control a mass of export production, because this is the plantation belt, the one of the center of a capitalist during the colonial time. But I think in Sulawesi, you have Permesta, which is more like a Manadonese, the ethnic Manados rebellions against Jakarta because of the past. There are so many of them are joining the colonial army, and this is limited in North Sumatra and North Sulawesi and Central Sulawesi. But in the south, you have also another rebellion which is connected, I think, with the Darul Islam and Tentara Islam Indonesia, led by Kartosuwiryo in West Java. So you have a regional rebellion. One is in the military, and the second is the Islamic rebellion, Islamic regional rebellion, which is centered in Central Java. You have also in South Kalimantan, and also you have in South Sulawesi and Southeast Sulawesi. So this kind of things happens at the same times, and it's really weakened the central government, which was already weak at that time.
I just want to add briefly that yes, the PRRI Permesta is actually a combination of a regional rebellion, an anti-communist rebellion, and also a struggle over economic resources. But I want to highlight how anti-communism was actually very much not secondary in here. I mean, Made has said it, but I want to say it again very clearly that it's actually a core motivation behind the rebellions, in a way that this whole rebellion was then also taken as an opportunity by the United States as a part of its own Cold War strategy and policy. So going back to the rebellion, again, that was just highlighting anti-communism as a big issue in here. So just to reiterate, so the regional commanders and their civilian allies, they really believe that the PKI was actually rapidly gaining influence, and this create a real fear for them, because PKI was building and mobilizing mass organization. They were campaigning popular land reform campaigns, and a lot of them actually involved bloodshed conflicts among the people in rural areas. And then there is also the PKI's growing proximity to Sukarno. And this is actually also seen as scary, especially for the rebels, to see Sukarno's politics, especially with Nasacom, that we will discuss later, and how this policy, Sukarno's policy, actually tilted the state toward communism. And by doing so, it threatened regional elites, that Made has mentioned, the regional elites. There is Islamic groups, there is military autonomy. In a way, when we talk about all of these people, it's not like they were already agreed to be together. They have their own interests. The regional elites, they have their own interests. The Islamic groups and also the military autonomy, all of them have but anti-communism actually united them. They wanted to stop the PKI's rise, basically, to power. And because of that, the United States viewed the rebels as a potential barrier to a communist Indonesia. This is how later, maybe after this, we'll talk about how, the U.S. intervened. There is a major actually operation by the U.S. involving in this rebellion.
The 50s is such a difficult period to discuss because it's so complex. So who were the people involved in the PRRI rebellion, right? So I think it's important to understand it isn't a regional rebellion because it involved a lot of people from the center. And the prime motivator of these rebellion was actually people from the center. It was people from Jakarta. So within the political establishment, The 50s was a very unstable period because, in general, Indonesia had governments for a period of less than a year. So we had 7 governments in 7 years between 1950 until 1957. But this actually highlighted a split or a divide between the more right-wing part of the political establishment, which was dominated by 2 parties, the Masyumi and the PSI, and the more left-wing or Sukarnoist part of the government, which was dominated by parties like the PNI and then the PKI. So there was a split within the political establishment. The idea that a lot of the right-wing parts of the political establishment was that a true election in 1955 would resolve the issue. It would then sort of, in their mind, confirm the position of the more pro-Western part of the government, and so it would create a more stable position. But actually, the 1955 election did not confirm that, because one of the major winners of the election was the Communist Party. So actually, for the establishments, let's see, Masyumi and PSI, it was actually became a much more difficult position for them after the election. So before the election, there was the idea that everything was going to be solved by the 1955 election. Afterwards, it actually became a problem. So that's one part of the grieving part of the PRRI and Permasa Rebellion. The other part is within the army. And I think we discussed this earlier, that the army was composed of 2 adjoining parts, right? One from the colonial roots of the colonial army, which is more professional, has its roots in the Bandung military school. And then the other one is from the PETA groups, right? Which is more from the Japanese influenced army groups. They have a bit of a different ideological setup. Both of them are anti-communist, but they didn't like each other, right? So in 1952, when Nasution was fired, that actually was an expression of that sort of deep divide within the army between what you would call as the more professional groups and the other one as the more sort of based on the Bushido spirit, the Sumangat spirit. So in the same year, when the political parties realized that the election wasn't going to decide a better fate, in 1955, Nasution was also then took over his former role. And in between 55 and 57, Nasution consolidated his role. So Nasution was anti-communist, but he became a determiner of the position of the army. And so 1957 was when the Perry Rebellion took place. But before that, so there was 2 things that was important. The last liberal democratic government ended in 1957. That's Prime Minister Ali Sastroamidjojo. Afterwards, Sukarno actually appointed the next Prime Minister, Juanda Kartawijaya, because by that time, this was the start of guided democracy, actually. So when Sukarno appointed the new Prime Minister, it sort of abrogated the parliament's position as an autonomous body. At the other hand, at the time when Juanda was appointed, the army under Nasution proclaimed martial law, right? So Nasution proclaimed martial law, and which sort of meant that he took over national military authority. And so the rebellion emerged as people within both the political parties and the army against Nasution and Sukarno, who were starting guided democracy. And the PKI was obviously also Sukarno. So a lot of the Sukarnoists would support, including the communists, the government in Jakarta, and those that didn't support it, then they became so not all of them, like Hatta did not, he remained neutral, but a lot of people within the PSI, they would then move to Sumatra to become part of the rebellion. So it was very much a clash of elites within the elites itself. So it was formally national elites within the army and then within the political system, and so it was a falling out of those factions. So by 1960, as you know, Masyumi and PSI would then be banned by Sukarno, Of course, by that time, Nasution would be sending his army to Sumatra to take over the parts of the Pera rebellion. So one thing that's important, as Anna has mentioned, is that a couple of reasons motivated the rebellion. The first is grievances of outer island, and this isn't something we should dismiss, because economic policies during the 50s was dominated by Javanese concerns, and they sort of glossed over real concerns from people within the outer island who had a different economic system because they had an export economy. So that's one thing. Secondly, anti-communism is very much real, but you have to also understand that within the Sukarno establishment, within Gaya democracy, you had this big army, right, under Nasution, who was also anti-communist. So while the rebellion was motivated by anti-communist concerns, it doesn't mean that Jakarta is now fully pro-communist, because they had a very strong anti-communist faction within the army running in Jakarta.
As has been mentioned already, the CIA was involved in backing the rebellion. What role did the U.S. play, and what were the consequences of it? I mean, the depth of the U.S. intervention was made spectacularly clear in 1958 when a CIA pilot on a bombing run was shot down over Ambon and captured. So what was going on? Why by the late 50s had the U.S. under President Eisenhower turned so decisively against Sukarno, supporting these secessionist rebellions? Was it just the increasing electoral success of the PKI? Was it the third worldist geopolitical posture and leadership that Sukarno had taken on? How did Indonesia's regional conflict get enmeshed in this global Cold War and in the U.S.'s designs for post-war global hegemony? And I think we should just emphasize just briefly, in the 50s and 60s, because Americans think so little about Indonesia today, that at this time, U.S. national security elites considered the fate of Indonesia to be more important than that of Indochina.
So the U.S. turn against Sukarno in the late 1950s was not only actually about PKI electoral success. That was actually central, but it was also about Indonesia's place in the global Cold War map, right? Indonesia mattered so much for the U.S. Why? First, it's huge. The archipelago is huge. It's resource rich. It's strategically also placed between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. This resonates even today with the recent agreement between the two militaries that the U.S. wants to have a free pass over our air, area. And the U.S. also at the time supplied key materials like tin and rubbers. So, actually, at the time in the 50s, Indonesia supplied 1/3 of America's tin and rubber. So remember we talked about Madiun defeat? That was a success in the eyes of the U.S. It's like, okay, great. We already were able to contain an Indonesian communism. But when in the 50s, PKI grew rapidly, entered the parliament, and became one of the largest communist parties outside the USSR and China, that alarmed the United States. And then on top of it, two things. Sukarno refused to join U.S. Cold War bloc. The U.S. actually, Eisenhower and Dulles, they created this anti-communist alliances in Southeast Asia called C2, and Indonesia refused. And that was like, that alarmed the U.S. But then also most importantly is Bandung and the non-aligned initiative that then also showed how Indonesia became dangerous. But going back for a little bit now, just to go back to connect to our previous conversation about the rebellion. So the United States at the time saw the rebels as a good opportunity to intervene and to shape and to basically stop this communist expansion in Indonesia. And so the U.S. covertly backed the rebels with money, with arms and air support. I think Revolusi, Van Reybok's Revolusi described that in 58 CIA support for the Sumatra rebellion was considered a major covert operation, around $10 million. And then there's also the Alan Pope incident, which become very clear, when the CIA pilot Alan Pope was shot down over Ambon in 58 flying for the rebels. That is a clear evidence of U.S. direct intervention in Indonesia. I want to talk a little bit also about Bandung and why Bandung was so important, and that actually really scared the United States even more. It's also because Bandung was the first large-scale Asian African or Afro-Asian conference. It was called Bandung Conference because it was held in Bandung, West Java, in Indonesia, in April 1955. And it drew leaders from 29 newly independent or developing nations, among them Jawaharlal Nehru in India, who is a nationalist. And then there is Chou En-lai, who is a prime minister of China. There is Gamal Abdel Nasser, who is an Egyptian a military commander of Egypt, and then Sukarno from Indonesia, and Prince Norodom Sihanouk from Cambodia. As you notice, all of these people have different backgrounds, right? There is a military background, nationalist. There is also, somebody who is a prince, and then there is also communist, and then Sukarno. But all of them actually sit down and agree to be united to promote Afro-Asian economic and cultural cooperation and to oppose colonialism. That was scary for the United States, right? Because, these people were not joining any of these blocs because this is for the United States. They're not able to see the world at the time beyond the binary. If you're not on our side, then you must be on the other side, which is the communists, right? But so they couldn't understand this non-aligned movement, and this non-aligned movement actually was amazing. It's so beautiful because they came up with the Dasasila, the 10 principles, and they one among them is about respect for human rights, equality of race, and then also respect of sovereignty. Imagine these people just gained sovereignty, and they were able to agree on respecting and protecting that together as basically a third power, basically outside of these two power, non-aligned, neutral, right? But for the United States, neutral actually means dangerous. So the Washington was never able to see Bandung as something neutral. It saw it as undermining the containment, U.S. attempt to contain these different countries. In some ways, Bandung made Indonesia, until today actually, if you notice, there's so many book published and then also conferences, meetings, all talk about how important Bandung even today. This is, for me, actually, it resonates with the Third International of the Comintern in 1920. So Bandung is similar to that in a way that for Bandung in its time, it became a symbol of post-colonial independence. However, for the U.S., again, it is it's dangerous because it is afraid that the other countries would follow suit, which is rejecting Western allies, tolerating or even including communist parties, and pursuing its own economic nationalism. So seeing Bandung on the one hand, and also the rapid rise of PKI, that could not be taken lightly anymore for the U.S. And this is the reason why it triggers U.S. policy in Indonesia as well as in the region. You mentioned this then. It triggers its policy in the region, but with Indonesia as its center for its strategy, to really contain Indonesia's communism, which then in effect will spread containment across the region.
To add a little bit about this, about the United States, I think it's for me a little bit clear that there's a shift in policies when the U.S. first involved in regional rebellion to ally itself with the the military commanders in the region, and also in some sections of the elites, Indonesian elites who went to the regions to rebel with these local commanders. The rebellion took place in the region, but the actors are actually much more tied to the center. And then at that time, U.S. tried to involve in these things, but I think they confront the real politics with one big question: whether keep the Indonesia intact or keep the Indonesian united as it is as Indonesia. So what's then they decide they subverting Indonesian's military. A huge program was launched in 1950s until 1960s, which they aim to educate all of the Indonesian military elites. 2,500 to 3,000 officers were trained in the U.S. under the program of IMET.
In Kansas.
Yes, in several places. Yeah, at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, Fort Bragg, and it depends. Yeah, they studied intelligence, they studied cavalry, but more, I think, mostly infantry who went to Kansas at Fort Leavenworth. Since it's become a tradition for Indonesian military, hook up with the American military, with American doctrine of war, even though Indonesia claimed that it has its own doctrine of war, but I think a lot of it's copying of the United States. So you have several, I think the majority of the officers are in the U.S. hands, including the 7 who were killed in 65. I think the majority of them are U.S. trained. So if you look at this, then it's safe. And then the United States, I think that it's better to keep Indonesia intact than to chop it into several pieces, because if you have in several pieces, in one pieces that become a communist, that this is more dangerous than you have the whole country to become a communist. It's a very clear, I think, strategy. It's easier to contain Indonesia as a whole, it's to become communist, than if it is break apart. So that kind of thinking, this is my hypothesis actually, in the U.S. mind. So that keep Indonesia intact, and then after the early '60s, when Sukarno tried to align himself and align Indonesian politics, creating the Beijing, Pyongyang, and Jakarta axis, for example. That's really for the U.S. This is crossing the red line, but I think the U.S. really conscious at that time. It is better to wait for the right moment. It is better to do subversion than to the direct confrontation. I was just it's a very different behavior that the U.S. has in other part of the region in the world. If they as Anderson say, that you are either with us or you are against us. So you are either a friend or you are either a foe for us. That's always the U.S. mentality. But for Indonesia at that time, not so much confrontation. Yes, President Kennedy tried to appease Sukarno, tried to even, he knows exactly that Sukarno loved being surrounded by beautiful women, for example, that he facilitate that, even invited Marilyn Monroe to see Sukarno and something like that. So, I think this kind of strategy of appeasement, which is very rare in the American foreign policy, it's being applied at a time. I think in the last several years of since the early '60s, not to play a hardball with Indonesia, but wait and see, and then try to subvert it in so many things, in so many areas, and also the economy. The U.S. lets the Indonesian economy collapse, and that's I think is very important in the next step. But for the 50s, I think it started. It's involved in the regional rebellion, but then it changed the course into more of a subversion. That's why I think Audrey and the Kahins wrote a book about subversion of foreign policy. Yeah, I think that's a really good title for a book.
No, I think Blimade has made an important point is that the U.S. never directly confronted Indonesia. It was always through a form of subversion and oftentimes very much covert. So while yes, the U.S. supported very much Masyumi and the PSI and the rebellion, the PRI rebellion and Premesta, it was conducted under covert operation by the CIA. So once Alan Pope was shot down, it became not a covert operation. It was sort of opened up, and then you can see that the U.S. then changed their policy, that they then gradually shifted to support Sukarno actually. So it's actually quite interesting why. I mean, on the other hand, I think it was because quite obvious by then that the rebellion was losing, right? So a lot of the main rebel areas in Sumatra, they were then so Nasution sent army to take over. So it used to have like they had also sort of tried to take over the oil provinces in Sumatra, but that was rapidly taken over by forces from Java. So by then, I think the U.S. calculated that it wouldn't be propitious to support a losing rebellion. But on the other hand, also that because it became an overt operation now, it's actually quite a shift from being anti-Sukarno to supporting in some ways Sukarno's position. I think another hand maybe is that they realize that there are components within the army in Jakarta that is very much more pro-American and pro-Western and anti-communist. So they had the opportunity to meddle in that context. So technically, after the PRI rebellion, the United States never intervened Indonesia again militarily afterwards, but they did through other means. But this was really the only time in which you have active American personnel in Indonesia within an operation.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners, who support us at patreon.com, and by Pluto Press, the independent radical publisher. A new book of Pluto's you might like is Backlash, The Global Rise of the Radical Right, edited by Don Kolb and Walden Bellow. As leftists, we often find ourselves predicting the future. Unfortunately, Capital's predicted slide into fascism is now well underway. Here, two preeminent Marxists collect a wealth of historical materialist analyses on the rise of fascism across the world, from countries including India, Russia, Argentina, Ukraine, South Africa, and many more. Dig listeners can get 50% off their first order of this or any book from Pluto Press using the code DIG50, that's DIG50, at plutobooks.com. Abi, earlier you were discussing how the democratic political order began to fall apart throughout the 1950s, which leads to the institution by Sukarno of a system called guided democracy. So Sukarno is at the head of this very unruly set of very conflictive political blocs and social forces. And the system he puts in place marginalizes political parties and outlaws two important political parties entirely, ultimately, the Islamist Masyumi Party and the Technocratic Socialist Party of Indonesia, or PSI, led by Syahrir. It was a system that aimed to develop these corporatist structures that would hypothetically harmoniously bind all of these contending political forces and social blocs into one harmonious state. Along these lines, it involved the creation of so-called functional groups or golongan karya, groups in society determined by their role: the army, laborers, women, youth, farmers, journalists, and so on. The provisional parliament, seated in 1959, allotted these karya groups over a third of all seats. In 1964, those functional groups became organized into the Joint Secretariat for Functional Groups, or Golkar, which would later on, we'll discuss this a bunch later on, become a key institutional form of the New Order military regime. Golkar would be its official party. Why did liberal democracy fall apart, and what was guided democracy? Was it meant to somehow overcome the antagonisms like those between the PKI and the army? What was Sukarno's strategy, and how can we assess the degree or type of authoritarian government that existed? Because while Sukarno was president and was outlawing political parties, his enemies in the army, or rivals at that point, I don't know how to describe it, an alternate power bloc in the army, not only controlled the repressive apparatus of the state, but also much of the infrastructure of the state itself, as well as vast swaths of the economy. How did the democratic order fall apart, and what was the guided democracy system that was supposed to replace it?
Yeah. So the liberal democratic order since 1950 had been considered as being pretty unstable, because as I've mentioned before, we had 7 governments in 7 years, right? What's important is that during the early periods of independence, there was a sort of rising expectation amongst the people that independence would result in expanding economic welfare. That didn't happen because, as we've discussed, much of the export economy was still under Dutch control. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction of what's happening in politics, and the fact that because Prime Minister shifted from Sukarnoist to more right-wing position every year, there was really no stable position in which you can then determine the path for development. That sort of was precluded. So this kind of thing was frustrating. And in 1955, Sukarno made a statement in one of his speeches that he wants to bury the political parties, and that sort of became sort of the main point for the guided democracy state. The assumption was that liberalism or parliamentary democracy failed because it wasn't able to consolidate enough political power that would allow for development to occur, right? But then what kind of system do you want to change it into? So in Sukarno's idea of guided democracy is that parties would be replaced with karya groups. So you have a parliament, you have also a lot of state institutions which would then allow representative of karya groups to participate in them, including, for instance, in stuff like national planning and development. So Sukarno is actually known as a very anti-economic president. In a famous exchange, he said he doesn't even understand what inflation was, actually. And so he disparaged what he called these liberal textbook economists, Western trained economists, which was part of the nascent technocratic groups in society, which, as you mentioned, it was very much within the PSE group of people, right? So within what Sukarno considered as his nemesis or his enemies. So the karya or functional sort of groups was to replace party-based democracy with direct democracy through representation of people that actually had real functions in society. As you mentioned, maybe the army, teachers, laborers, you name it. So various groups were held together. Now, it never came to fruition because it only represented a small part within Parliament itself. but it was institutionalized under Sukarno. Another thing which is important is the guided democracy state couldn't really be enforced without the support of the army. So the army was a central component. And you have to think that the army was not anti-Sukarno. So the army, a lot of the people in the army were pro-Sukarno. There were different degrees. So within the Navy and the Air Force, they were very much pro-Sukarno. But even within the army itself, even Nasution and a lot of the high-ranking ones, they were very sympathetic to Sukarno. The 65, when the army sort of took over and threw Sukarno out of its presidency, that occurred only later on when conditions had worsened. And you have to also think about that. So 57, when the guided democracy sort of started with martial law, the army basically took over the entire colonial economy. So you had 700 Dutch enterprises taken over, initially by PKI, by the labor movements, but then immediately the army took it over from the PKI. And so the army then suddenly became a massive managerial groups because they needed to run these companies. So they developed relations with economists. So they had trainings and so forth where economists would come and teach, how do we run these companies over? So how do we run them well? And so that was the start of the new order in a sense, because then you had this link between army managers and technocrats, where they sort of became, they developed a similar vision of what development was. And so it was a very much state-run development in which the army took a central position. And that's not something Sukarno opposed to, actually, because he thought that the army was an important group that allowed for the guided democracy to emerge. In fact, if you think about, for instance, army officials in positions in government, like for instance in positions as governor and so forth, there were more governors of army background under Sukarno than under Suharto afterwards. So within that context, Sukarno very much pushed for army expansion into these areas because, in a sense, they had the same vision, and at least up until the later part of his rule, the army supported him. So a lot of the armies were pro-Sukarnoist as well. So, but he had to sort of delicately balance it with the PKI, because the other power base or supporter base of the Sukarno was, of course, the communists. And Sukarno wanted all of them, I guess. He wanted both to be part of his new state.
And the nationalizations of the Dutch industry, which was part of the increasing conflict over Dutch control over West New Guinea, which we'll get into more, that also empowered the PKI in these industries. And so it's empowering two of the sharpest antagonists in Indonesian political life simultaneously.
That's true, because although the vast majority of the enterprises were taken over by the army, there were parts that were under PKI rule. Particularly, for instance, one of the oil companies, the national oil companies called Permigan, was under the PKI. And then, of course, within the context of Karya, the PKI sort of had access to these companies through company boards. So you had developed company boards, which was to sort of express the Karya involvement. So and one of the major part of that was to have communist-related labor groups or labor leaders entering into the government, entering into the companies. So again, of course, it also empowered the PKI at the same time. Yeah.
Can I just add while we're at there, just very quickly, that while we have been talking about this so much, about how the military, not just expanding, but taking control, building infrastructure in the economic sector of Indonesia, I think one thing that is still absent in our conversation is how they also expanded and also take over the judicial infrastructure of Indonesia, which is so important for the New Order era. So this is the time, 1950s is the time where there is this military judicial nexus. What it means is that the military began to actually work with, basically there's a collaboration between civilian jurists and army officers in building the legal foundation. There is this AHM, Academy Hukum Militer. So basically, the military law academy, basically, and then this was where civilian jurists and military lawyers, they drafted rules and procedures, and also training the military cadres, not just military also, but also civil cadres of legal operators that later on, built this legal infrastructure in Indonesia.
I want to just add a little bit to that. So in the 50s, the AHM, the Academy Hukum Militer, produced 2 batches of graduates. And the first batches was, I think, in 1954, 55, they graduated. So, but the majority of, a significant part of the companies that were taken over, Dutch companies that were taken over or nationalized by the government, was taken over by AHM graduates. So they became part of the leadership of these companies. So because at the time management had not developed yet into a proper science, so legal study was actually a much more near position for. So if you want to look at managers, a lot of them were actually studied legal, and traditionally in the Netherlands, legal study was the way to come into administrative or managerial posts, actually.
It's very important to highlight that the important role of Sukarno and 2 axes of power, the military and the Communist Party, and also, but formally, Sukarno not formulated into his ideology, but instead he want to incorporate the Islam faction. So it's become Nasakom. I think that's the core ideology of Sukarno, nationalist, agama, religious factions, and communists, which is, I think, only Sukarno himself understood that concept, and I think it's much more imaginary concept than the real fact. But the politics beside this is much more complicated. We have seen the military is in there, the Communist Party is in there, and the Islamic group become estranged from the system, kicked out from the system, I think, and then they changed the Islamic politics in Indonesia forever, because at that time also then before Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama was separated, and also the division between the Islamic groups also is very apparent, so becoming more and more visible. But then this is a very complicated time, and Indonesia experienced, I think, the economic degradations immensely, and near collapse. I think the peak date is in 65 with huge inflation, and Indonesia has no economic anymore. So basically, this is a failed system, centered only on Sukarno. And then every faction that involved in this, I think, try to make the system, try to stop the system, make it not working. And I think constant bickering, even as bad as you compare this to the liberal democracy, I think liberal democracy is still way better than this system. So I think this is also a kind of reminder for Indonesians that if you really think to rely on the military, I think again. This is create huge consequences for the society and for the republic.
Anna, can you get a little more into the breakdown in liberal democracy, what was attempted and why it failed?
Mm-hmm. Right. So during the parliamentary democracy, there was an attempt to actually write a new constitution, but it failed. And that failed was one of a major momentum that led us to guided democracy. So let's actually dial back and rewind to the early days of Indonesia's independence. And many of this is actually written by Buyung Nasution in a lot of his publications on Constituante. But the country's first constitution in 1945 was actually put together very quickly. Do you remember just in episode 3, we talk about BPUPKI, right? It was done only in a few months. It was written by appointed representatives, not people elected by the public. Then in 1950, Indonesia tried again with a second constitution. This was even called the temporary constitution, quote unquote. So it's basically acknowledging that this isn't the final version. We'll come back and do this properly with elected representatives. And that moment finally came in 1955 when Indonesians held their first national elections, right? So in December, people voted for members of the parliament. And then in December, they went back to the polls to elect an even bigger group whose job was to write a new constitution. And this body was called the Constitution Assembly, or for Indonesians, we call it Constituante. Now, the Constituante started meeting in November 56 in Bandung, which is actually very symbolic because they met in the same building that hosted the famous Asia-Africa Conference, the Bandung Conference in 55. And really, they were working. They got to work. They worked really hard for about 2.5 years. They debated, they negotiated, drafted, voted, all of it. Among the things that they talk about that I find very important, and it's such a loss after the end of it, was women's rights. They discuss women's rights, they discuss human rights. These were all central. But here's where things got stuck. The biggest issue was on the question of what should be the foundation of the Indonesian state. One side wanted a constitution based on Islam. The other side supported Pancasila, the pluralist national ideology. And so this debate got intense. And even though they managed to agree on about 90% of the constitution, they couldn't settle on that final crucial question. Eventually, some leaders actually were ready to compromise, but by then it was too late. In July 59, President Sukarno stepped in. He dissolved the Constituante by decree and brought Indonesia back to the original 1945 constitution. And that move had very big consequences then. It strengthened executive power and gave the military a much larger role in politics. And so even though the Constituante never finished its job, it's very important historically. Why? Because it brought together over 600 of Indonesia's top political figures at the time. Basically, it's actually showing the country's entire political elite during this critical moment. And until today, people are still trying to figure out, why, who killed the Constituante and why. This is John Rusa's question in a recent panel that I watched. And he referred to Dan Left's book, The Transition to Guided Democracy. And Left basically argue that the fall of the constitutional democracy had multiple causes. One, the failure of the Constituent Assembly, especially in terms of whether their question in terms of whether Indonesia should be a secular state or an Islamic state. Then there's also, according to Left, party fragmentation that we have discussed earlier, the rivalries between nationalist, Islamic, socialist, and communist parties that created this political paralysis, creating like breakdown after breakdown every year in the government. And then also there is this military intervention, right? The army actually increasingly supported Sukarno's call for a stronger executive, and then seeing parliamentary politics as ineffective. But also Sukarno was also at fault because he believed Indonesia needed a revolutionary, anti-liberal political system based on national unity rather than this party competition. And we will see this reflected in Nasacom later. It's all about cohesion, unity, and less about, healthy, competition, basically. And so the Constitution was not destroyed by just one actor, but all of this, it collapsed because of political elites lost confidence in it, which then allows Sukarno, with the backup of the military, to replace it with the guided democracy.
Sukarno gave his famous Tricora, or Triple Command of the People speech on December 19th, 1961, and it called for the mobilization of, quote, the entire Indonesian people to take control of West Papua, also known as West Irian. So Sukarno created a special military unit to mount incursions against the Dutch and just generally intensified this combined diplomatic military campaign until Indonesia won control of the territory in 1962. It was a conflict that precipitated a global crisis. It drew in the Dutch, the US, Australian, British interests. It also was deeply impactful on Indonesian politics, as all of these armed conflicts are on the road to 1965. And of course, it was also deeply consequential for Papuans, whose desires none of these outside parties took into account, and who ultimately went from being under Dutch colonial domination to Indonesian colonial domination, a dynamic that remains in place to this day. Why did West Papua become such an overwhelming issue for Sukarno and for Indonesia? How did various factions of Indonesian political life, Sukarno and other nationalists, the communists of the PKI, various factions of the military, how did each approach the conflict? And why did the U.S., shifting at this time from Eisenhower, who again had supported the PRI Promesta Rebellion, to Kennedy, why did the U.S. shift towards backing Indonesian claims to West Papua, even as they were incredibly alarmed by Sukarno?
Yeah, I think the Tricora is, I think Sukarno launched it at that time. I think, first of all, to divert people's attentions to the economic hardship that's already happening in Indonesia at that time. And the second thing, I think it's always in the imaginary of Indonesian nationalists that the territory of Indonesia is from the city of Sabang in the west and Merauke in the east. So Merauke is in the east, southern Papua. So I think this kind of imagination, we have national song, patriotic songs about that and everything. That's so basically consolidated the image that Indonesian territory is the former East Indian territory, whatever it is. And Sukarno, even at that time, adding that it should also include the southern Philippines and Malaya and a whole Borneo. But then after Papua, I think we try to do it with Tricora, to People's Command. And then Ganyang Malaysia, or I don't know how to translate this Ganyang Malaysia. So in order to prevent the Malaysian state from becoming a state. So this kind of things, I think, typical Sukarno. I think he needs something to divert people's attention on politics and from economy, and then to give more power to the military. But that's all. This has become a bargaining chips, and then Kennedy, as we know, they tried to appease Sukarno, but also the United States, I think strategically about the position of Indonesia. So it is in the middle of a conflict in Southeast Asia, fighting for power with the communists in the north. So at that time, then the U.S. think that for Netherlands, it's better for the Netherlands to give up the claim in West Papua and give it to Indonesia. So then in 1962, there was a New York Agreement facilitated by the U.S. in New York under the UN between Indonesia and the Dutch, and it gave Indonesia the power to to do the administrative power over West Papua, West area at that time, in 1963. But in 1962, the UN decided in that New York agreement, the UN will create a transition government. So this is the first time the UN create become the executive power. I think UNTEA, United Nations Temporary Executive Authority. That's what you call it. So and then Indonesia took over the administrative power in 1963. Yeah, until it's been there forever since. Until 1969, Indonesia held under the UN held what they call it the Act of Free Choice, which Papuan often say that the act of no choice, because there's no choice except to join Indonesia. That is the context. But I think when Indonesia took over the power in West Papua, the Dutch has to retreat. A lot of they already created the structures of a government in West Papua. So they create the police power, they create some sort of military, but not a professional military, but still poorly trained. And these people are against Indonesian power. So in 1963, you already see the resistance among the Papuans at the time. What the most important thing I think I want to highlight is for all the history of Papua, never ever the Papuan itself at the table to discuss about their own destiny, their own autonomy. It's always determined by the other parties. In 1962, before, I think during the round table, it's between Indonesia and the Dutch. In 1962, it's Indonesia, the Dutch facilitated by the US under the UN. And after that, in 1969, it was the Act of Free Choice, but Indonesia was very successful to change the format into one man, one vote, under the very racist reason that Papuans cannot read and write. So they are mostly, I think, they only have a very tiny educated elites. So under this pretext, Indonesia argued that they are not capable of thinking. They are not capable of determining their future, their own destiny. So it's better to pick up several people, and they have to decide through deliberation and then discussion and then agree for whatever the result. So only 1,025 people were chosen at that time, and then in the process that a lot of people say that with a lot of intimidation, manipulations, even torture and terror. So the overwhelming of this representative, because the process is obscure from the public. So I think all of these people were decided to join Indonesia. So that's kind of thing. I think the results of the 1962, the New York Agreement, and then West Papua was trapped in the middle without ever being consulted about their own destiny, their own future, and their own freedom.
What an incredible irony, this classic colonial logic that the native is not capable of self-government.
Papua is such an interesting case in Indonesian history because it is sort of a repository for outsiders' imagination for a long time. So in the colonial period, amongst the Indo-Europeans, there was this idea of creating an Indo-European homelands on the highlands. And then later on, of course, under the Dutch, after independence, it became a Dutch project, a Dutch national project to sort of liberate the Papuans from Indonesian oppression. And so they did, to a certain extent, as Bli Made has mentioned, sort of push forward for the creation of a Papuan nationalism, however tiny that was. What's interesting is after independence, Sukarno has always pushed for Papuan inclusion into Indonesia as a major point in the relationship with the Dutch since 1950, when the Roundtable Conference didn't decide Papua's position then. So, for instance, in 1956, when the Indo-Dutch Union was abrogated, it was on the basis of the Papuan issue. And then, of course, in 1957, when Dutch assets were nationalized, it was also under Papuan, under the issue of Papua itself. So by 1961, when Sukarno made that gesture to take over militarily, Papua had become sort of a mythical status, right? A national goal to take over Papua. What's interesting, and I think, is that, of course, as Bli Made has mentioned, the Papuans have never been consulted in this issue at all. So they've always been a sort of a chess piece for these various powers. What's ironic is that, of course, Sukarno's goal to take over Papua used the rhetorics of Bandung, in a sense, right? It's about anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism. And then, of course, another irony is that it was stamped by the UN. So the UN is a major institution that create new kinds of colonialism. You could see that in Israel and Palestine, and you see also in this case in Papua as well, that they stamped, or they legitimized the takeover of Papua without ever consulting the Papuan people itself. So in a sense, you see these parallels of the post-colonial American order, which produced new forms of colonialism, which Indonesia has inherited, and which has apparently there's no I haven't seen any gesture from Jakarta to address these issues at all. So it'll continue to become an issue, and it's one where I think generally the Indonesian population has no problem with. So the camouflaging of the Papuan issue within the context of anti-imperialism and Sukarno's revolutionary anti-capital, anti-imperial goal makes it such an interesting a case. Now, for the American side, I think one thing which needs to be addressed is that, of course, by the 60s, by the late 50s, Americans already, I mean, of course, even in the colonial period, the vast riches of Papua has been understood, right? And then the geological explorations conducted in the late 1930s by American oil companies, and then in the 50s by Dutch geologists and American geologists as well, including I think the son of Rockefeller, if I'm not mistaken.
The grandson.
Was involved in these. So, but the potential for American capitalism to enter into Papua, I mean, I think sort of pushed the Americans to support Indonesia, because under the Dutch, it would have gone much more for Dutch capital, right? But under Indonesia, then there's a higher potential for America to sort of become part of that. And by that time, even by the late 50s, even under Eisenhower, Americans were already shifting their position to Sukarno. So they were much more supportive of Sukarno. And then, of course, under Kennedy, it became even more so. So there was that aspect of American capital seeing a huge potential, which borne out very well after 65, right? With Freeport, and with apparently Papua has the biggest gold reserve on Earth at the time. Much of it was transported by Freeport back to the U.S. to, I don't know where Freeport is from, but in one of the states in the U.S. So there is that aspect as well, that support by capital enabled for, ironically, America to support Sukarno's anti-imperial, anti-capitalist goals of taking over Papua.
I just want to add a little bit about PKI's approach to this conflict. Because I think PKI approached West Irian as this unfinished anti-colonial revolution, so it sees this as a anti-imperialist struggle, which is basically, so when Abi is explaining how the Sukarno have this anti-colonial tone, that actually is a PKI. It's not just backed up by PKI, but also inspired by PKI's attitude or position vis-a-vis Papua. So for PKI, West Irian was not just a territorial dispute. It is actually a proof that Indonesia was still not fully independent. For PKI, they saw that in Irian that imperialism persisted through Dutch control of West Irian and also global capitalism and Western influence in the region, including Rockefeller's interests, right? And so this is why PKI strongly backed Sukarno's confrontation strategy, the Trikora mobilization, and all the diplomatic and military pressure. And PKI actually also used this as their general strategy of turning national struggles into mass political participation. So it becomes, after this, it helps to frame PKI no longer as a class party, but also as a national patriotic force, because they mobilize workers, peasants, youth organizations, right, in support of this campaign, and then presenting itself as this nationalist and patriotic force. Also, and in addition to that nationalist tone, PKI also linked this struggle to anti-imperialist movement globally. So after Bandung especially, this is such a big, tone also globally, right? To get solidarity with socialist states. This is why also at the same time PKI and also later Sukarno, they continued to maintain ties with Soviet Union and China. Especially for the West Irian campaign, actually Soviet support for Indonesia was pretty significant. And also, in addition to that, and I think I mentioned before how PKI have this vision of national economy, at least in their understanding of a bridge or a step toward socialism is this national democracy. And so they saw this conflict in Papua in terms of anti-imperialism, but also breaking foreign control, but also moving toward economic sovereignty and later socialism. This event helped normalize PKI's position as a central actor in Indonesia's national politics.
Sukarno spiraled from the conflict over West Papua directly into a conflict with Britain as the UK moved to guide the British territories on the northern tip of Borneo, Sabah, Sarawak, and Brunei into a newly federated Malaysian state with Malaya and Singapore. Malaya is, at this point, the British territory on the peninsula across the strait from Sumatra, just to orient people geographically. Sukarno adopted this policy, Made referred to it earlier, of confrontation or confrontasi. The idea was to mobilize the Indonesian masses and the military to disrupt the very foundation of this new Malaysian state, which he and others charged was a neo-colonial project organized to protect Western power and Western economic interests. And this was an incredibly complex, deeply consequential conflict. It led to a rupture with the British, including Indonesia's seizure of British-owned industry. It deepened Indonesia's economic crisis, including because Sukarno cut off all trade with Malaya. Again, think about just the centuries of trading history across the strait between Sumatra and Malaya, a very close trading partner. It also intensified domestic Indonesian political divides within the military between anti-communist army versus a navy and air force that were more Sukarnoist, or even in the case of the Air Force, PKI aligned. It drew in the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and it drew in the United States, which not long after supporting the regional secessionist rebellions under Eisenhower had under Kennedy pivoted to a policy of engagement that involved continuing to deepen ties to the military while also attempting to convince Sukarno to accept a deeply controversial IMF-led stabilization program, an economic restructuring package that we today would probably describe as neoliberal. But then with Kennedy's assassination and Johnson's inauguration, amid the intensification of confrontasi, Sukarno announces that 1965 would be, quote, the year of living dangerously. And at this point, the U.S. turns sharply against Sukarno. There's a lot to unpack here, as with so many different things we've been discussing, but what was confrontasi? What was Sukarno's strategy? How did it play out in so many ways to deepen the crisis that would put an end to Sukarno's rule and usher in the nightmarish anti-communist massacres in 1965? And how did this, not to open up a total new box of worms, but how did this all grow out of the communist-led anti-colonial insurgency that throughout the 1950s had exploded across Malaya, a conflict euphemistically described by the British as the Malayan emergency?
The confrontation started by, I think, Indonesian subversions into the Malaya, especially because there's already, subversions towards Sabah and Sarawak. Yeah, there's two very strong communist movement over there. PGRS, Partai Republik Rakyat Sarawak, and then Paraku, Partai Rakyat Kalimantan Utara, the North Kalimantan People's Army. So during the Dwikora, I think after the Dwikora, after Sukarno announced Dwikora, buoying by the success of the campaign in the West Papua. So I think he saw the creation of Malaysian is the next project, anti-imperialist project, and this is the time when Sukarno closely aligned Indonesian foreign policy to Beijing and to the Pyongyang, and then I think a little bit taken aback from Soviet Union, and of course in confrontation with other what he called is colonial and imperialist power in the West. So, and then Sukarno directed army to do the operation, and the army started to recruit the people who are already in the movement at that time, the PGRS and Paraku, brought them to Java, especially to surrounding Bogor, and trained them. A lot of them were trained by the Indonesian military. I think in the number is thousands, probably 5,000 or something. And then after they got the military training, they sent back to the North Kalimantan. But in Malaysia itself, I think the British is unstoppable, because at that time, Malaysia and Singapore is still part of the Malaysia. And as you have known that for centuries, there's a trade between especially the island of Sumatra and Western Kalimantan. They traded to Singapore. Singapore become the center of all of Indonesian commodity. Singapore becomes the biggest exporter for rubbers and peppers, for example. That's because of this Malaysia, Sumatra and West Kalimantan producing a lot of rubber. So they sold it to Singapore. That when Sukarno tried to sever these economic ties, and you can imagine how that affect Indonesian economy. But putting that aside, then there's a direct confrontations between the Indonesian military and the British army, which is no match with two Indonesian military. And not only that the British got the help for Indonesia by itself, but also got the help from other Commonwealth countries like Australia, for example, that some of books about by Australians generals who have fought the battle in the jungle of Borneo. The sad things about this is that after the failed attempted coup in 1965, the Suharto government changed course and dismantled all of this confrontation and had launched anti-communist operation in West Kalimantan, which is created an ethnic tensions over there, which is reverberate even until now. Indonesia has to confront the people that they trained militarily before, because so many of them are the Chinese. What is that? And the Chinese also coming back and forth between North Borneo and Borneo, the part the West Kalimantan. So the Indonesian military has to fight their students actually in the warfare, and then one of the biggest operation that will become the pattern of Indonesian anti-guerrilla. They actually invented this method in West Java during the anti-DI Indonesian Islamic Army, the ITI Kartosuwiryo, when they move out the population from the interior region to the coastal area. They did this in West Kalimantan in order to separate the Chinese from the local population, the Dayak. They are almost identical, and they are conducted the Sai War. This is, I'm not making this up because this is from a book by the local army commander at the time, the Sai War operations. They killed one of the Dayak tribal elders. They cut the genitals and put it in the mouth, and then put the Chinese calligraph in the body. So that's really angered the Dayak. And then the Dayak mobilized through Tariu, or passing torch from one kampung to another, and they mobilized and they kick out all of the Chinese from the hinterland and then put it in the coastal areas, and a lot of people died because of this tactics of warfare. They did this against in East Timor in 1975, 78. They call it Kikis operations. I think a quarter of the population died in East Timor because of this military tactics. So that's a lot of similarities and legacy of this conflict, the confrontation, either in the military, as a military tactics, as the ethnic tensions, as the ethnic relations, and even local politics in West Kalimantan and in several regions. But overall, the confrontation is a failed project because some of it weakened Indonesian economically. It created an economic crisis, and then most importantly, I think, then it created a room for the leftists, especially inside the military, that this is the dangerous time. So who have to move first, and then the left, I think, the moves first, and then they create a trap for themselves. Then we have 65, the failed attempted coup inside the army, which then the army blame it to the communists, their main rival. So that's a tragic ending of the confrontation.
Maybe I can talk a little bit about the economic situation. So the start of the collapse of the economy, you have to probably think started after the takeover of Dutch enterprises, because these were the main engines for export, right? Because Indonesia had been an export-based economy under the Dutch colonial system. So by the early 60s, export had gone down significantly because a lot of these military-run enterprises were inefficient and they broke down in a lot of cases. So by the 60s, the only parts of the economy that was producing dollar, that was still creating dollar, were the oil sector, actually. So which was still under the hands of large multinational oil companies. So by 1962, Indonesia was entering into hyperinflation, into heightened inflation, and had a massive sort of fiscal gap. You have to remember that Sukarno got a lot of loans. So, for instance, from the Soviet, over $1 billion worth of military equipment was sent from the Soviet Union. This included submarines and fighter jets and so forth. This was for the Irian, for the West Papua project, which of course never became a hot war, but massive investments paid for by Soviet loans. So state of the art Soviet equipment. Now, in 1962, the IMF actually sent a team to Jakarta to rehabilitate the economy, but that failed because Sukarno never wanted to approach a disinflationary policy. So, for instance, they had agreed to a loan by the IMF in order to fill the gap, the fiscal gap during that period. But even after the agreement was signed, Sukarno's first act was to buy 3 new jets, for the Indonesian National Airlines. So it was very clear from parts of the IMF that there was no fiscal discipline at all from the Sukarno side, and they weren't prepared to conduct tightening of the fiscal spending. And then, of course, afterwards you had the confrontasi, which also required large amounts of money. But these kind of money, which was just printed, so Indonesia was just printing rupiah, was sent to the army in order to expand their capability. So the army didn't have much of a problem with receiving the rupiahs there. But by 1965, of course, with the closure, with confrontasi and the closure of access to Singapore as one of the really only port of entry for Indonesia's export goods from the outer island, really stepped up the problems. And by 1965, inflation reached 600%. So it was really in the hyperinflation territory. And you have to also remember that since 1960 until 1965, the growth rates plummeted to around 2%. This was different from the 1950s, where it was maintained at 5%. But you have to remember that the Indonesian population was growing at around 5% in this period. So it was a negative growth rates throughout the period, at least -3, right, with comparison with the population growth. And by 1965, Indonesia's GDP per capita had fallen to $60 per person, lower than during the late colonial period, and the 5th lowest on the planet. So Indonesia had become incredibly poor by 1965, and this sort of fed into the fall of Sukarno, but probably also the ferocity of the violence that occurred afterwards, just because of just the level of poverty that had been endured, because effectively the colonial economy was destroyed, but there was nothing to replace it with.
Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I'm actually gonna follow up on Abi on that very brutal and sad note as we conclude this conversation, in that this period of confrontasi is also the time when the British especially, but also Western powers, really encourage physical and violent actions against PKI. So there were documents in the genesis of Confrontasi where it says that the British ambassador, Sir Andrew Gilrish, he wrote that, quote, "A little shooting in Indonesia would be an essential preliminary to effective change." There were documents also that urged Indonesian generals to take actions against the PKI, and then promoting narratives of PKI brutality and Chinese involvement, slander PKI's name, using claims of PKI cruelty. All of this really lead up to later, as we see in 1965, the brutal killing of communist, alleged communist members, right? But also, in addition to what we have talked about, don't forget, there were military provocations, especially with the British. There were land and air incursions. It noted that between January 1963 to August 1964, there were 140 times, plus dozens more air incursions. So there were escalated tension. The economy was bad, as Abi already saying, but also there is this military provocation from the British and its allies. And the Western actors, but then also this language of the use of slander, and also encouraging violence against the PKI, that all led up to 1965.
And just to conclude, though confrontasi in retrospect was a pretty disastrous strategy, Sukarno wasn't wrong that the formation of Malaysia was a neo-colonial project.
Yes, I agree. Although that's a controversial statement, I don't want to be attacked by my Malay or Singaporean colleagues.
Yeah.
But it is true that the framework is also that they saw PKI and Sukarno, they saw Britain and Malaysia as a British neo-colonial project. There is a term neo-licom, is it?
Nekolim.
Neo-colonialism, imperialism, and colonialism that Sukarno at the time was fighting, and that was the reason why there was confrontasi.
And there was major interest here for Western capital, particularly in oil, both in Indonesia and in Malaysia.
Yes.
Especially in Brunei. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That was Rianne Subijanto, Mada Supriatma, and Farabi Fakih for episode 5 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media, IndoProgress.com. Mada Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Farabi Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department of Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting, "The question is, can mankind fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia?" While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theoria Francos and Ben Mabey. Thanks to Martin Lohr for engineering this intro and outro. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram and Blue Sky at The Dig Radio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, please also rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners. But what really does that is you just telling people that you know or don't know to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us, and do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.